So I should start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, so what I want to try to do, and I'll start off with a little bit of political background, but in this case, it's not sort of just to give a briefing and then go on to some topic. You know, a couple of things that Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche have been saying in the recent period, the last few years, and to a certain extent the last few weeks. There are two things that I think I'll touch upon because that's the best I can do. Number one, Helga, we just had this conference, which I know some of you were at in Berlin, has called for a dialogue of civilizations. But more significantly, Helga has made the point that we need a change in the culture, in the global culture. Now, part of getting the global culture to change is getting a relationship amongst the existing nations, which is only best based on the high point of each civilization. You could say the Renaissance that have occurred in different civilizations. The Great Renaissances in China, the Tang Dynasty, other periods, Confucius. In India, there were periods, the Gupta period of great developments in classical art and science, and so on. Obviously, the Greek Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, we could go on. In many cases that we don't know much about. But to bring them together, and this is in part what happened in Berlin, in particular at the concert on Saturday night. I just invite people to go to the website and as these things come up, see them if you weren't there. But we had remarkable development, and this is what Helga has called for as necessary politically today. Now, not anything short of that. And, you know, politics have changed over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Because you could say 20 or 30 years ago, we might not need that kind of complete change in cultural outlook. And we might have been able to come up with a few reforms that would have gotten us through the crises. That's not true today. Today, we're 25 years from the fall of the Soviet Union. And at the time, what Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche and other members of the organization were saying is, this is not the victory of the West over the East. But in fact, the Western system, as it was evolving at that point, was also set to collapse. Now, sad to say, and what Helga and Lynn said at the time was the only way to avoid this is to open to the full development of the Eurasian landmass. This is how far back our approach to the Eurasian land bridge goes, minimally to 1989, 1990. And otherwise, there would be a collapse of the global culture. If we tried to spread the existing London-Washington axis, the London, or the so-called Washington Consensus, which is really ordered from Great Britain, from the monarchy itself. And I'll make a point because people think that's absurd. Even in Europe, people think, in the United States, people think it's absurd. But in fact, that's where we are. Now, Lynn has made a certain particular expression of this, which is, first of all, that the issue is one of creativity. Now, of course, the problem for most of us is, what does that mean? What is creativity? And Lynn says, well, it's creativity per se. That is, it is simply creativity if we understand it as an actual principle of human development and our relationship to the universe as a whole. Now, more recently, he said, think like Einstein. Now, you know, it's funny because years ago, I hate to sound old, but I am. Well, I'm not that old, but I'm getting there. Okay. You know, it's a funny point to reach the point in life where you look around and say, well, maybe I am the oldest person in the room. I don't know for sure. There's a few of you that look and might be close to my age, but are around there. Or sit on a subway and say, you look around, even on a subway, you know, New York subways have a lot of people. And you say, oh, maybe I am the, well, probably he or she's a little older. Okay, I'm not the oldest one on the subway. But anyway, Lynn said, think like Einstein. Many years ago, we had a publication called The Campaigner, which was our theoretical magazine. This is back in the late 70s. And we had one entitled, Think Like Beethoven. Well, one point that I want to make is that isn't a big change. Because one of the critical points of thinking like Einstein is classical music. Now I'm gonna reference that when I get to the part about Einstein, just to give you a flavor of what Lynn is talking about. Because it really isn't just that he was a scientific genius, and he was. We're not going to get to go through special relativity and general relativity. I want to give you some of the controversial elements of it. But he was as a whole person, as you could say, as a person, he was a genius. He was on the right side. One time, he was on the right side of almost every issue that he got involved in, and including some controversial scientific issues where many people thought he was wrong. And I'm not talking about the specific effects, but his approach, even now, 100 years, about 60 years, 61 years after his death, you were coming back to having discussed some of his ideas. Obviously, science develops and so on and so forth. And in fact, as people may know, and this is just part of it, but there's, for example, scientists have now, after denigrating the idea, gone back to the conception of a unified view of science. Now, this has to go way beyond what they've thought of, and even what was available to Einstein, and where Lynn has been a leading figure. Because part of the problem is this separation of different disciplines, not only art from science, but within the sciences. Physics, biology, and so on. Indeed, these are not really at all. In fact, it's not just that they're not separate areas, it's a mistake to think of them separately. They cannot exist separately. One of the points I'll make is that in order for us to really fulfill what people like Lynn and Einstein are talking about, we're going to need to look at physics from an entirely different standpoint. From the standpoint of not only biology, but life. Things that are not entropic. But even more importantly, the human mind itself. And that's not the brain, which is most people I saw. Boy, I tell you, I saw one of these. I've been watching a lot of these videos of things, and I saw one where they had a moderator. It's called the World Festival of Science. And they had a section on Einstein, and it was sort of Einstein, his science, his something, and his brain. And they had a journalist do the questions. It was some top scientists. Of course, that doesn't make them all very good. But she was fixated on the brain. And they had the guy there who was doing a study of Einstein's brain for some crazy stuff. And she kept coming back to how big was his brain, and how many folds did it have, and it was nuts. I mean, it really tells you. So we're not talking about the brain. We're talking about the human mind. Now, in part, to get there, why are Lynn and Helga talking about this way? You have to approach it from the standpoint of the mind. In one sense, you say, well, the mind is separate from the physical universe. In another sense, you say, well, the mind comes, is only a recent discovery, at least on the planet Earth. We don't know if there are minds elsewhere in the universe, but so why start with that? Well, indeed, the human mind is what the universe produced. And we can prove a certain relationship to that universe, which is what Einstein operated from. Now, why do we have to take this standpoint? Now, this is what most people will say. Why not? Isn't that a bit much? Okay, you might be right. It might be interesting to talk about this, but let's get, as Lynn likes to say, let's get practical. What can we get done? Can't we approach it some other way? For right now, let's get a better system in Europe. Let's deal with the euro problem. Let's improve our relationship to Russia. Let's have a dialogue with Russia. That's a good thing. Let's improve, all right, the British left. Let's see what we can do with what remains. I mean, we're going to have to keep Europe somehow together. Let's be practical. Okay, we've got to deal with the Chinese. But let's face it, we're going to have to compete with them because it always comes down to competition. It's always one nation against the other. It's always geopolitics. It's always a zero-sum game. Let's be practical. Well, the problem that we face is things have gone to the point where there are no practical steps that can be taken short of a kind of revolution. I'm not talking about throwing cobblestones and bricks and whatever, although if we don't do the right thing, I'll make a point. Even it may come to that in some places. If we look at the Middle East, okay, we've got a horrible situation. But a revolution in the culture. I mean, the kinds of things that have to be fought out is, for example, we've been doing the music, the concert in Berlin, but more generally, we're using the development of musical choruses to organize people. What do you hear? I mean, I hear this, for example, it's true, and I'm sure there's an equivalence of this in Europe. There's probably even some use of the same thing. A lot of youth in the United States think that rap music is creative. It's not just that they won't just argue that I like it. Some of them might say that. But the real ones who are into it intensively, their argument is it's creative. It's poetry. It's real. It's the street. It's my life. It's how I express myself. Now, the fact of the matter is, at this point, unless you deal with the fact that that music is destroying their minds, you can't organize them. Unless you at least engage in that debate. Engage in that quality work. I'll tell you honestly, just as an observation, because Denmark, my wife is Danish, and she, Denmark is a wonderful country. People are happy, but I've seen the youth, and I tell you, they look too much like what the Americans call goths or skinheads or whatever. They have tattoos. They have alternate clothing, which is skull and bones and skeletons and 14 pins through their nose and whatever the story is. If you have a youth for whom ugliness is a high point of their culture, something they try to achieve, then you have a youth that have lost some sense of purpose in the world. Lost some sense of what it is to be human. Because being human is not ugly. And so this is a real problem. It's something where you see the difference in cultures. For example, in China and in particular, the youth tend to be optimistic. I'm sure there are some that pick up some of the Western culture. They do, and that's a problem. But beyond that, they have a sense that to be human is somehow has a quality of beauty to it, a quality of development, a quality of progress and discovery and excitement. You don't get that in too many youth in the West these days. I'm not saying there's nobody, but as as a general characteristic. Now look at the situation we have. I'm not going to go through a whole history, but look at what's going on right now. You have the collapse of the Western financial system. Deutsche Bank, 50 trillion, 70 trillion in derivatives. Of course, they always say you can net it out, but it's not true. No crash happens that way. They don't sit there and net it all out, and then it all comes down to almost zero, and at the end of $50 trillion in derivatives, you exchange a dollar back and forth, and the whole thing is solved. When did it ever work that way? That's their argument. But it doesn't work that way. We have a system, 50 trillion in Deutsche Bank, which is really not a German bank. It was, it's basically centered now in New York and so on and so forth. But anyway, what's the total gross domestic product of Germany? I think it's about 3 trillion, something like that. The total gross domestic product of Europe, of the European Union, is $18 trillion. So you're talking about somewhere between 3 and 4 times the total nominal gross domestic product. Deutsche Bank is bankrupt. In the United States, we can't afford anything except the banks. I just saw a report, for example, in New Jersey. Now, New Jersey is not well known because it's kind of a funny place, but it's still got 8 million people. Actually, it's the first or second most densely populated state in the United States. It's a little bit more like Europe in terms of population density. It's about 8,000 square miles, so it's about 20,000 square kilometers, and we got 8 million people. Nothing else comes close in the United States. They have an idiot for governor who ran for president, and they just declared that they're going to stop all repairs and maintenance on roads and highways because the budget didn't get through. So, he's trying to squeeze people. In the United States, we have, for the first time really in our history, we have an increase in the death rate in middle age, or actually from about 25 to 54. In other words, the number of deaths per 1,000 people, or 100,000 people, has increased in those age brackets under the Bush-Obama presidencies. The study went from about, I think, 1999 to 2012 or 2014. Suicide rates are up. The whole real story of the healthcare facilities in the United States, some of this gets confused. The real story is, yes, we have 5 or 10 hospitals in the United States that are world-class hospitals. It's not as though we don't have this stuff, but it doesn't get used unless you're in the top level or for some reason or other you chose for an experimental process. Otherwise, right now the basic line is if you're over 65, we have to think about whether it's worth taking care of you. So they increase the medical rates and so on and so forth. Now, what do we see? We have the European Union falling apart. I'm not going to try to detail this. Tom has briefed you on it, and there'll be more discussion. But, what is this signal? We don't know exactly what's going on in Great Britain. And I'm sure we should be finding out. But what we do know is, number one, Europe was shocked by the idea that the British voted to leave. Of course, there's a little twist in this, because the idea that the British have played, which gives you a clue to their role, is they always like to set certain things up that allow control but they never quite join it themselves. They always stay a little on the outside. You know, Churchill is a good example of this. Churchill wanted, it made it very clear they were not going to give up the empire. It is why they fought the Nazis. They didn't fight the Nazis because they wanted to save the Jews. Forget that. They fought the Nazis after they had set the Nazis up because they didn't want to lose part of their empire, and they realized that was where it was headed. But nonetheless, the exit from Europe was a factor that was somewhat surprising, particularly outside of Britain. Again, what the British establishment thought, I suspect there were even splits in the British establishment. And this is probably why it was so close. But a surprise. They're out, and the European Union is dead. There's not going to be a European Union. These guys like Juncker and Schultz, who are saying, you know, we're going to have a new Europe, a stronger Europe, a core Europe, you know, the founding Europe. I mean, forget it. Europe is completely gone. Partly because the entire banking system is gone. Now you have the Chilcot report. Now this, I think, is going to turn out also to be significant. Very significant. Tony Blair, I'll tell you something. Tony Blair was the model for the recent American presidencies. As of course has been shown from the Chilcot report himself, he was buddy-buddy with George W. Bush. And the idea, I tell you something, I got to laugh a little bit. The idea that George W. Bush was the one who ordered Tony Blair around is beyond absurd. George W. Bush, as we used to say, couldn't carry an idea from one end of the room to the other. That was Tony Blair's war. That was the British Imperial War. Now, the U.S. Under Bush did it. Obama has ambition. He wants to be more like Blair. He's not willing to admit he doesn't know what he's doing. He's too much of a narcissist. He wants to, you know, he modeled himself on Blair in many respects. This is the new Labor Party, you may recall. Of course, what they had to do with labor, I have no idea. It was so new that they didn't have to labor at all. So, you know, but the Chilcot report makes it clear. Now, we knew this, we said this, and I'm sure other people said this, but the fact that this now comes out within days of the Brexit as a report, and I did see Blair's effort to apologize, and he was a little rattled. He was a little shaken up, I should say. Now, so you have the end of the European Union, you have the collapsing banks, and now we have, this of course is set off in effect where Carney, who's the head of the Bank of England, is now, we've got to just pump out money. Pump out as much money as we can. We call it, in the United States, it's called helicopter money. You don't even find a mechanism like, you know, buying bonds, the central bank buying bonds. No, we don't even bother with that anymore. That doesn't work anymore because it puts too much debt on the central banks. Now you just say, okay, come and we'll give you money. Maybe if you stay home, we'll drop money on your house. The system is completely gone. And of course, this occurs at a point at which you have a new wave of terrorism. We had Baghdad, we had Bangladesh. There was even today, apparently, I don't know if it was terrorism, there was a bombing in Taiwan on a subway where 21 people were injured. Now, they haven't declared that a terror incident, so I don't know what the story was. You have Baghdad, 250 dead. It's now admitted. Now the interior minister, but actually the prime minister, is under extreme pressure. You know, and this, what did the Chilcot report confirm. All of this is a consequence of the Iraq War, in particular of 2003. And I will tell you, one critical feature in understanding Blair, I think, some of you may remember this. What was it? I always forget this woman. Oh, I know it was. There's this British actress who is supposed to be, as is usual, you know, if they're British, they're supposed to be the greatest actress, the greatest. So Helen Mirren, she played Queen Elizabeth II and got an Oscar for it. Okay. Now, even in the movie, and this is true, in the movie, the character who saves the British royal family from disgrace after the death of Princess Diana, the murder of Princess Diana, was Tony Blair. He was their man. He was the guy who told them what to do, who told them what to say, who told them how to handle the press. So this isn't, they may sacrifice Blair, but whatever the story is, there's something. It's not easy to just brush it off. Oh, he's another politician, just get rid of him. This is the guy who was the envoy for the quartet to the Middle East. Now, I'll tell you, part of what is also going on to keep in mind, because this is extremely important. Look, you've had now, since the murder of Gaddafi, and increasingly since Ukraine, you've had the confrontation with Russia and to a certain degree China. NATO has pushed east. It's pushing further and further to the borders of Russia. I will tell you one thing. As soon as I heard, personally, in November of 2013, that there was a push to take Ukraine out of the Eurasian Economic Union and into the European Union, and that there were some demonstrations, I knew that was bad. Because Ukraine represents something that's the heart of Russia at this point. Not that it's Russian, but you have to recognize that World War II, about 2/3 of World War II was fought on what we now call Ukraine, or parts of Poland, and so on and so forth. That's where the Russians faced the Nazis. Yes, it got to Moscow, but a tremendous part of that war was fought in the Donbass, in Ukraine, in the areas of Ukraine, that were then turned over to Poland after the war, and so on and so forth. You get the situation you have in Poland right now, where you have a nut right-wing presidency, government. And they're going to start thinking about taking back territory and confronting Russia. There's no way that the Russians are not going to respond to this. You have to be out of your mind, completely out of control. The Russians, as people here, lost 27 million people in World War II. There's a reason they call it the Great Patriotic War. In the United States, we call it World War II if you can count. I mean, there are things better than that in the United States, but amongst the younger generations, you're hard-pressed to find somebody under the age of 20 who can tell you what year the United States entered World War II. I wouldn't put a bet on what percentage would get that right. And one of the important things that's developed, you have two things that make this very different than just a gloomy picture. And that is the Chinese. The Chinese now represent an economic and political future. Because it's not just, they've done remarkable things. 600 million people lifted out of poverty. Tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail and other forms of rail. They're now moving to develop the interior. They've started the One Belt, One Road, the Asian International Investment Bank. Their view is what Xi Jinping calls win-win policy. not zero-sum game, not geopolitics, but the cooperative development in particular of the developing world. And it is something that is inspirational to people who see, my God, they mean it. They're not just playing a game. The Africans, for the most part, and I'm not saying that there aren't problems that come up, but you know, you go and you say, don't you understand? You get some Washington Post reporter, or you know, The Economist or whatever, and they go down and they say, don't you feel as though the Chinese are coming and they're raping you? And the Africans say no. They are building something. I'll give you a good example. Ethiopia. Now we had an Ethiopian, for those of you there, who spoke at the conference. Ethiopia is a very interesting place. It is the second largest country in Africa. It's about 95 million people. So apparently, you know, there was a case where a reporter went down and spoke to somebody high up in the government and said, well, don't you realize that you're being looted? Isn't that what China wants? Of course, they're a typical colonial. And the Ethiopian guy said, well, no, I don't think so. We don't have any raw materials. I think they have coffee, but coffee's not big in China anyway. So, you know, they're not being looted. This is not a colonial enterprise. And so you have an actual resistance and development, both. Not just the negative. We saw in Syria there's resistance. People are going to fight. In Ethiopia, people are not going along. You see this increasingly in Africa. You see it throughout Asia. There's a resistance and a solution. And the fact of the matter is, Putin has played a very, very significant role. One of the things I think that has changed the dynamic, such that in the West, you get a Brexit from the population, such that you get even the chaos we have in the United States. I'm not saying chaos is good. Chaos can lead to hell. But if you're not going to have any real leadership, people are going to respond. You can't say don't be chaotic to people. They're going to tell you at a certain point, the hell with it. And you take the United States with people, you know, living standards collapsing, infrastructure collapsing. We're no longer the leading nation. We could still be a leading nation. China has led the way in space exploration, the far side of the moon, and so on and so forth. The United States used to be a leading space exploring people. We're not anymore. We still have some hangovers. We just sent a satellite out to explore. But the one thing I will say, to explore Jupiter, which is good. Very good. But you know, why did it take 5 years to get there? Because we have not developed certain fuels. And how is the satellite fueled? By solar panels. Now, frankly, this could be an even more effective mission if we were using, for example, plutonium to fuel the aircraft. But at least we're doing this. At least Obama, who said famously, you know, this guy, he says some, you have to, see, I don't think we laugh enough at some of these guys. He famously said, when he was asked about going to the moon, oh, we've been there. Now, how, you know, it's like, I don't know, I wouldn't say that about the Grand Canyon, you know, or the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Oh, I've been there. Been there, done that. Then at another campaign event, he said, somebody asked him something about fusion energy. He said, well, we don't need any of this fancy stuff. This is frontier science. If you're not doing that, what are you doing? So the difference in the situation is that with the way Putin has moved strategically, For example, he's been very open on the question of dialogue with Europe, including the Ukraine situation. He moved on the Syria situation, probably the case that's most obvious, because nobody expected him to go into Syria and actually, open the possibility of destroying ISIS. So what does the United States all of a sudden look like? We're there, and we've backed up ISIS in the sense of protected them from military attacks by mixing them in with these moderate terrorists. It was a less painful death. I suppose you could say that. Some of them don't chop your head off. Others maybe they use more painless means. I don't know. They're moderate terrorists, and we support them, and therefore you don't want to shoot at somebody from ISIS because they're standing next, not to a civilian, but to a moderate terrorist. Civilians we can kill. Drone a few hospitals or whatever, that's okay. But let's not hurt a moderate terrorist. Now, yeah, if you don't make fun of this stuff, you get angry and you get trapped into the debate, and what can you say? Moderate terrorists. No, this is, as we know, this, and one of the things that went on yesterday that I don't have a full report of is Walter Jones, a congressman, along with a couple of other congressmen, held a press conference on these 28 pages that have not been released that point to the Saudi role, along with the British, but particularly in this case, the 28 pages, the Saudi role in 9/11, which is coming up very soon, which will be a point of intensification. But they called for the immediate release of the 28 pages. And one of the congressmen, I think it was Lynch, actually said, if this isn't done by soon, at least by 9/11, we will get on the floor of the Congress and we will read the 28 pages into the record. Okay? That's a different universe. Why is that happening? Because I think of what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. See, that's the way the world really works. Everybody wants to look for a proximate cause. And by the way, I wouldn't put right now, don't try to forecast the U.S. presidential election. Because you got Trump, who's a wild card, who's a crazy man. I wouldn't, and so on. But why did he get where he is? Because people are angry. People are upset about what they're living through. But now you had Sanders, who was more reputable, people thought, but really was, if any, it was he had voted for the Iraq War and so on and so forth, and he was a fraud to a large extent. Now you have Hillary, who's really bad, and she's under some question with this FBI thing. So I don't know what the world is in incredible turmoil in what we call the transatlantic in particular. But there is progress in Asia, in China. You have a recently elected Philippine president who may be backing off from confronting China. And the U.S. is pushing a confrontation with China over the South China Seas. Now, what Lynn and Helga are saying, at least as I can understand it, is given a world in this kind of turmoil, you can't take it away. I mean, some of the things going on in the United States, I don't know how to evaluate all of it. But even in the last couple of days, the equivalent of some of these upheavals is we've had a new round of police shootings of black males in the United States. So there, protests are starting again. But there's an instability in the situation that is global and universal. And there is, we just opened up the second Suez Canal. The Panama Canal is opening up. The Chinese are investing in it. In effect, a great majority of the world is in a position now, if we did it, to say, okay, London, it's over. We'll implement Glass-Steagall. New York, it's over. We'll go back to FDR on this. We'll implement the win-win policy. But what we have to do to make this happen is change our view of human beings. We've gone through, in the 20th century, and this is Lynn's point, and this is where I'll get a little bit to Einstein. In the 20th century, increasingly what's risen is a view of mankind that is essentially reducible to an animal or a machine. Now, we may, you know, people go to church, people go to the mosques, people have other ways of expressing it. They have different kinds of beliefs that they'll talk about, spiritual, whatever. But it's actually doesn't speak to what the nature of mankind provably is. It's in most cases, it's giving up on mankind in this world and what we can do for some conception of saving oneself. Whether it's being, you know, one of the chosen people of one kind or another, or going to heaven, or, you know, whatever the story is. It's some, and then of course you have what's mostly the actual system that we live under. And to me, this is really more than anything what the British Empire means, why Obama was so bad, or is so bad. And we still have the view that Obama should be removed from office. Nothing would be a beautiful kick in the pants with whatever he's got left, 5 months, 7 months. But the basic point is the most important element of the British Empire, as far as what I think, and you know, I do think this is something I've learned from Lynn, at least to some extent. It's British epistemology. It's the British view of humanity. It's Darwinism, in the sense that since there's an evolutionary process, we can reduce human beings to their biology, to being apes, or something that derived from animal life, or even more, that you can reproduce human intelligence with a machine. This is, by the way, this is now, there's a whole new round of this going on. The idea, you know, this goes in waves, that we can produce artificial intelligence. We can create machines that think like human beings. Frankly, it's provable that you can't. Kurt Gödel proved it. Now, in some way, we may be able to control biological forms or whatever, and create certain kinds of living organisms. But that would require a whole change in science. That would require understanding the principle of life. What makes life life? You know, I was watching again one of these confabs of scientists, and they were supposedly talking about, well, actually what they call quantum biology, which has some interesting features to it. But, you know, the big point was toward the end, one of these guys says, well, you know, what the real problem that we're discussing here is we don't know what life is. But this is all about quantum biology. Well, I mean, and of course we really don't know what life is. What is the principle that's reflected in a living organism, which gives it direction, which gives it purpose, which gives it some quality of intention, of goal orientation, you know, or what we call teleology, final purposes. And that's what we're dealing with in life. Life moves, it's alive. It does things that are not random. What about human life? And again, you hear these discussions, and all of a sudden one of these guys will admit and say, well, what is consciousness? And it's not just consciousness. It's what Lynn calls creativity. Now let me take a step back and give you an idea of what this kind of a conception of creativity is. Because what Lyndon LaRouche is saying is creativity is necessary. You could say one thing about creativity. In a certain sense, creativity is what Leibniz would call necessary and sufficient. It defines human beings. It's the defining character that demonstrates that we are not like animals. We're a different domain. We used to refer to this as transfinite. In other words, we live in a domain such that you can't measure anything that we do from the standpoint of an earlier domain. You can't measure anything that's human from the standpoint of ape life. And I mean, there's so many funny things about this animal stuff. It's just crazy. Chimpanzees, first of all, are the most abominable creatures you ever met. They're just nasty. They kill each other. They eat their babies, contrary to this image that people once upon a time liked to spread. I think it is funny. The counterpoint to the chimpanzee is what they call bonobos. This is now a sort of another species that looks a lot like a chimpanzee, but it's gracile, it's slender. And what's their big shtick, supposedly? They have constantly polymorphous sex. They're constantly engaged in sexual activity, and this makes them the better version of the chimpanzee. So this is the choice that you have. You can be a chimpanzee and go around killing and carrying out wars and eating babies, or you can be a bonobo hanging from a tree, engaged in multiple sex all day long. This is not what happened. Now, interestingly enough, to me, the entree point to understanding what Lynn is talking about is Lynn's physical economy. And put it in the simplest terms, and you'll realize how different this is than the way people think. Even though it's not that complicated. I'm not going to write any formulas. I'm not good enough at the math anyway. And mathematics is not creativity. But what did Lynn do in the physical economy? He started from the standpoint that what is the relationship of human beings in society to nature? How do we survive? How do we reproduce the human species? Well, we do something very unique. We apply knowledge in the form of technology to an ability to extract from nature things that really are not obviously there. Even hunting and gathering. As hunters, we don't make a great possibility. We're not fast. We do have a lot of stamina, actually, relative to other animals. So if you want to spend your life hunting down giraffes in the Kalahari Desert, we're somewhat suited to do that. But the idea that we could survive as a carnivore is pretty far-fetched. Then we developed agriculture. What did we do? We took scientific knowledge, not just tools. We learned certain things about astronomy. Who knows how far back astronomy goes? At least probably somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years. Arguably in some of the cave discoveries that were made, which run 30 to 40,000 or even 50,000, there are signs of calendars, but at least 5,000 to 10,000 years. We applied that science to changing our relationship to nature. We were able to get things from nature that didn't appear to exist. For example, our ability to use copper to make and tin to make brass, to make metal tools, to then move up in the development of our knowledge of the metals. All that was scientific knowledge applied to technology that improved our ability. These things didn't sit there. There's no brass that sits in a riverbed. There's no steel that grows on a mountainside. These are things that, in a certain sense, how did we do this? Was it trial and error? No, what happens is certain human beings have an idea. They have an imagination, but it's a rigorous imagination. They're going to figure out how to use their ideas of what's there to extract something that is not obviously there to the senses, and in fact, in the form that we use it, isn't there. We create the existence of the density, at least, of certain materials and so forth through creative scientific innovation. Now, if we didn't do that, we wouldn't survive. We wouldn't make it, and because we would run out of the resource, not because the resource isn't there. Famously, in every cubic meter of soil, you have virtually every mineral you could want. But you can't extract it because it takes an enormous amount of energy to extract it. So as your technology runs up against certain barriers, you have to develop new science, more scientific knowledge, to develop new technologies that give us new resources. As we've always said, oil was not a resource in 1400. It was, if you found oil in your backyard, that was bad news. It didn't make you rich. It made you very poor. And then it became wealth. Why? It wasn't wealth in the ground. Wealth is not in property. Now, if you think about this, what does it mean? What do you actually want to create in an economy? More objects? To a certain extent, you need that. What you really need is more people. Because as these developments occur, the level of education, the lifespan, the availability of living standards, and I don't mean living standards just so you live well. For example, if you want to create children who can work, let's say, now in a modern economy, you can't deprive them of access to certain of the products of that society. How does the child begin to learn about electricity, about controlling light, and other things? He learns that he has a certain power over these objects. And the power comes from certain places. He also learns to relate to other people socially because he needs those people in order to be able to deal with these objects and this power. If he doesn't have it, he or she, he's deprived of a capability of understanding the science, technology, and society that he or she lives in. So you have to produce, if you produce poverty, you're not just producing poverty. You're undermining the development of the society itself and the powers of creativity. Now, secondly, creativity is the defining character of the human species. And to use a philosophical, technical term, so to speak, ontologically, the nature of our being is that we are creative. We have the capability to be creative. We can express ideas that provoke creativity, that develop other human beings. If we don't have that, then we're not acting in accord with the nature of the species. And I think, my tendency, maybe because, I won't go into it, but I'm not a person that has a certain kind of background. So my tendency is to make the point that this is necessary. It is beautiful, if you think about it, that human beings have this, every human being, and that there is a morality in giving access to this to children. And the more scientific development, the more children you need, the more creativity you need, the more you need to think about the future. Most of us, if we want to answer some of the theological questions, what is my contribution? What is my soul? What is it that I leave behind? What do you leave? You leave a future to the future generations. You contribute to that future. Ideas, teaching, development, saving people. And not only that, but you have to do something. You have to, as I think, you have to not only create a future, but you have to create a future such that those people will have the ability to create a future. You have to, in a sense, look over the horizon, beyond the horizon to things that you can't see, but that you have a sense you have to act on. You have to give the people who are on that horizon, you have to guarantee that they will be able to look to the next horizon. And that's, at least begins to get at something of the purpose of society. Now that's what that's Lynn's physical economy, or at least one expression of it. We are necessarily creative. And unless we get that idea across to other nations, to other people, to ourselves, we're going to fail to implement what we need to do now to guarantee a future. We will be faced with war. And look, this is crazy. As Lynn has said, the British are bluffing. Obama is bluffing. We can't face off the Russians on the eastern border with 4,000 troops or whatever. But we're playing with fire. If we think we can bully the Russians, bully the Chinese, push them, get them to concede, after what we did to them in the 1990s, it's highly unlikely. So what then happens? Well, either we provoke the Russians into a strike, which is not out of the question if they think they're going to be struck themselves.
Nuclear strike.
Yeah, nuclear strike. Mm-hmm. Or if we bluff, and then our bluff is called, then we launch out of sheer desperation. It's not just accidental war that you have to be afraid of, although that is a possibility. That's what we are threatened. That's one aspect. The other aspect is what I told you about the United States. We are on a downhill slide in the United States. I'm not going to detail any more. We have high rates of addiction to pain medicine, and so on. We have a growing impoverished section of the population. We do not have the developing infrastructure. We have very little science left, and what's left, look, I'll tell you something, just to give you a joke. It used to be, you'd say, well, we're creating rocket scientists, and they're working on Wall Street. They hire some of the top mathematicians and so on, scientists and rocket engineers. They were hiring them in the 80s and 90s to do these fabulous algorithms for the financial world, for a derivative. You have to be a genius to figure out, I'm using the word loosely. Now, Wall Street is screwed up. So where are these guys being hired? The well-trained physicists, whatever. They're being hired in sports teams.
Sports teams.
Yes. And what are they hired to do? They're hired to do even more sophisticated data analysis and physiology of the athlete to make them perform better and better and better, and to be able to choose who are the really better players. This is true in sports in the United States. I can name the teams that hired some of these guys. Now, what an incredible waste. This is true. I'm not making this up. Now, we barely produce enough scientists, and now they're, doing data for the local football team or something. And they can tell you exactly, whatever. So, now what Lynn is talking about is real creativity, and that's why he references Einstein. And I tell you, to get at some level of the point, well, before I get to that, I want to make another point because it'll be important to understand Einstein. Because the question is, how do you create creativity? If that's what needs to be, what do we really need to reproduce is creative human beings. The real value in an economy is the rate of production of creative human beings, scientific and artistic geniuses. That's how you measure yourself. Now, how do you do that? You say, well, you can give somebody scientific training, not mathematics. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but the great scientists were not mathematicians, contrary to what people believe. Mathematics is destructive unless it's used as an adjunct to real science. Because what is mathematics? It's a set of rules that you have to stay within, which means you can't produce anything new. You can't create anything. Now, how do you really produce creativity? This is where classical art, you can't produce it by saying to a child, go out and discover something. He has to have some idea of how the mind needs to work to discover something. What the nature of the human mind is. Some of that you get from history, you get from looking at the way in which discoveries, repeating some scientific activity. But the core of it you get from classical art. Because what do you do particularly in the music, but also in the poetry and drama? They have different aspects to them. But what do? You create a certain apparent paradox, an apparent problem, that if people keep acting, or if the musician keeps going the way he or she is going, in the composition or in the performance of the composition, it's going to break down. It's going to end up sounding like noise. It's going to go off on or it's just going to be boring. Because some of what happens is you just keep repeating yourself, maybe with a slight change, but if you listen to certain kinds of music, like rap music, but even folk music, one of the problems if you're stuck with just folk music, which may be beautiful, may have nice melodies, it tends to be repetitive. So if you don't have a sense of creating something new out of the musical canon, you're stuck. And what does classical music do? Besides the choral form, the social form, and so forth, is it demands of you that you create something unheard of before. Or at least you perform it, and in the course of performing it, you repeat in a certain sense in your own mind the discovery. What did the composer have in mind, and what did he or she do that changed the nature of the music and expressed a fundamental idea about the creation of ideas? I mean, music is in some sense a meta discipline. You're creating ideas about how ideas are created. You see this in singing, choral. That's why polyphony is so important. That's why well-tempering was important. Because it gave you degrees of freedom in the development and expression of new ideas. Now, this is one thing that Einstein, and in particular to a certain extent his generation, but Einstein knew. Now there's some, he was a reasonably developed violinist. Now some people say he was not that good, some people say he was very good, I have no idea. But he, by all accounts, he was a reasonably accomplished violinist. But what was important to him was the music was critical to his ability to think. It's not as though he went and played the violin and that made him feel relaxed and then he came up with an idea. It's that the music was the way he thought at best. Planck, for example, was almost became a professional or a concert performing pianist. It was only at a certain point he decided he was better off as a physicist. And that generation, most of these people, Nernst, all of them played Ehrenfels. Well, they weren't all the great scientists, but this culture of developing ideas, of working through the ideas, bringing new ideas to bear, was rooted in classical culture, in classical poetry. And Schiller, for example, Einstein's mother was a great reader of Schiller, Heine. I think also his father was a fan of, I shouldn't say a fan, but a proponent of Heine. This was the culture of the at best that was developed. And this is what allowed somebody like Einstein to be a creative thinker. For example, he was not a mathematician. He wasn't a bad mathematician, but he wasn't a mathematician. He wasn't a great mathematician. He was a physicist. He had his famous Gedanken experiments. He created in his mind certain considerations. And he asked them what was the solution to the problem in the considerations, or what was reflected. What if I could travel as fast as a light wave? Would the universe stop? Is it possible to go beyond it? Now, that wasn't the solution. But it allowed him to think about things that otherwise he wouldn't have thought about. And ultimately, he did come up with certain critical ideas about the constancy of the speed of light. But even more than that, the universality of laws, of physical laws. That's what the principle of relativity is, the opposite of what you think it is, and is often portrayed as. Well, it's just your perspective. No, the whole point in Einstein, given some of the problems of the time, which were more technical, in electromagnetism, the theory of the ether, and so on and so forth, there were certain problems that came up. And Einstein said that we have to have a system where the laws of the system apply to the whole universe, to everything, no matter what your uniform motion is. And later on, no matter what your acceleration was, no matter what your rate of change. That was general relativity. So it wasn't relativity. It was really, what are the universal principles that I can say are true no matter what motion you're undergoing? And this is what he applied to essentially everything. And his unified field theory efforts were not one equation, but they were an effort to come up with the underlying universal principles that governed all of what seemed to be the problems in the universe. Electromagnetism, gravity, the strong and the weak force, and the nuclear level. And think about what is going on in the 20th century. In the 20th century, you have an attack on this kind of thinking. From Bertrand Russell, to a certain extent Hilbert, and what was part of the attack? We've got to stick to the mathematics. Let's axiomatize the mathematics. Now, ironically enough, this is occurring when Euclidean geometry is going out the window. You got to think of the great ironies in these things. For 2,000 years, Euclidean geometry was the truth. Then we discovered through the 19th century and the development of electromagnetism, the work of Gauss and Riemann and company, that this Euclidean geometry wasn't true, even of the space that we live in. And at that very point, people like Hilbert, Frege, Peano, and others that were working in that direction are thinking in terms of formalizing, that is, an axiomatic system for mathematics and then for physical science. And this is Bertrand Russell and 20th century positivism. That's why they went after Einstein and others of that type, but particularly Einstein. Because Einstein didn't come out of the scientific establishment. He was educated, but he was a Zurich patent clerk when he presented his special relativity, the photoelectric effect, all in 1 year, Brownian motion, and so on. And then 10 years later, he comes up with general. But also, just to give you an idea, it's not true that he then died after that mentally because of quantum theory. First of all, he was one of the contributors to quantum theory. He discovered the photon. He discovered the role of the photon in the exchange of energy. He discovered the Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a sort of quantum denying effect, statistical approaches and so forth. But he simply said quantum mechanics is not the whole story. It doesn't give you the principles that govern the universe. And we've been off in some wacky directions ever since Einstein was attacked at Solvay in 1927. But he continued. In fact, a lot of people here may know what quantum entanglement is. This is one of these funny quantum effects, which comes down in the simplest form. If two particles, well, it could be if you split an electron as it decays, or if two particles interact, they become entangled. What does that mean? Well, particularly if you take an electron and you split it, it decays into two other particles. They have a spin. It's an angular momentum. And in the electron, I think it adds up to 1 or whatever. I might have some of this wrong. Well, now that you split it up, you have half spin, or you have spin that goes to one or the other particle. Now, if you know that this one has spin 1, you automatically know that the other one has spin 0. They're entangled even though they might be a billion miles apart. Now, this is part of the quantum strangeness. Who discovered that?
And if you intervene on the one, then it has effects on the other.
On the other, immediately. Even though they're
so
local.
far apart, they can't have.
This is called non-locality. It may be true. Einstein didn't believe it, but he discovered it. And part of his efforts to demonstrate some of the problems with quantum mechanics, in a paper in 1935, he discussed this. So it's not true. Einstein did work on the perturbations of the solar system well into the late 1930s and 40s when he was, 60 years old. So this idea that he was somehow, he lost touch with these scientific advances and he became an old doddering dinosaur, which is what you'll get from a lot of science departments, is simply not true. I'll give you one idea of this. Let me check the time. I don't know. I just want to give you some idea, since we want to leave some time for some questions. I'll give you one idea of this. Because for a long time it was believed that, he'd been superseded and so on. And, he may have had some problems. But this is one book by a guy named Kumar. Not a bad book, not a great one, but... no, wait a minute. After having been marginalized during the last 30 years of his life because of his criticism of the Copenhagen interpretation, don't get upset, and his attempts to slay the quantum demon, Einstein has been vindicated, at least in part. Einstein versus Bohr had little to do with the equations and numbers generated by the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And then he just goes on in that vein. The Copenhagen interpretation is the quantum idea that sometimes things are particles and sometimes things are waves, and never the twain shall meet. That is, if you set up an experiment to deal with it as a particle, you deal with it as a particle. If you set up an equation to deal with it as a wave, you deal with it as a wave, and you never mix the two. So, and that, what is it? Is it a wave or a particle? It's both or it's neither. We don't know. That's part of the quantum problem that Einstein, by the way, was not a determinist. This is the other line on Einstein. That quantum theory is non-deterministic because it's got randomness, not creativity. And Einstein was a determinist who wanted a classical ability to predict the future. That's not true, and I will give you proof of that. It's not just an assertion. Wolfgang Pauli, who was another physicist, got himself involved in the debate between Einstein and Born, not Bohr, over this. And Born keeps saying, well, Einstein believed in determinism, and that's why he can't understand quantum mechanics. A little bit of chutzpah, but anyway, I guess you need chutzpah. Pauli then sent Born a letter. It seems to me as if you had erected some dummy Einstein for yourself, which you then knocked down with great pomp. In particular, Einstein does not consider the concept of determinism to be as fundamental as it is frequently held to be, and he denied energetically that he had ever put up such a postulate in a letter to you that it's determinism, it's machine learning. No, what he wanted was reality. All Einstein was saying was there's an objective reality that's not just the observation, that's not just the measurement. That, for example, if the electron goes through a slit in the so-called two-slit experiment, and then it lands on a screen in some based on a probability, it has to exist somewhere in between, says Einstein. Quantum theory says no, it might not exist in between. It just hits the slit and then goes on the screen as a probability. So Einstein was arguing for reality. But the other side of this, and there was more, also, by the way, Einstein was very much clear on the problems with Newton. He says at one point Newton was wrong when he said hypothesis non fingo. But I have an even better case where he's arguing again with this guy Born, and he says, and I find this interesting because there's other indications of his relationship to Leibniz, which Lynn has commented on a number of occasions. He says, this is where our attitudes really differ. For the time being, I'm alone in my views.
Can you read more slowly?
Oh, yeah. This is where our attitudes really differ. For the time being, I am alone in my views, as Leibniz was with respect to the absolute space of Newton's theory. There now, I paraded my old hobby horse once again. This is 1950, something in the I think it's 54. So this is a year before he dies. So Einstein was absolutely clear on Kepler, on Leibniz, on the problems at least with Newton. And as I mentioned, he wasn't a mathematician. In 1912, when he was on the verge of general relativity theory, he didn't know the mathematics needed for, then you got to realize he's 33 years old at the time. So he wasn't a young man. And he needed a certain kind of mathematics to deal with the concept of general relativity, to develop the so-called field equations. And so he turned, and he knew what he needed. He needed Riemann, who was, of course, a great physicist mathematician of the 19th century. And he called upon a friend of his, I think his name was Grossman, to teach him Riemannian mathematics, tensor calculus, and so forth. But he knew he needed that because he knew the physics. The idea, if you train scientists to be mathematicians, you're going to destroy the idea. That's really what happens. It's like a straitjacket. Now what we need is to approach biology. I'll just reference Vernadsky and so forth. But the other thing I want to bring up is who Einstein was as a person. He fought against this quantum mechanics as the complete theory of physics, which is now recognized. I was going to go through more, but I'll leave it. That, you know, there are so many holes in science today. There's plenty of work to be done. We don't know a whole hell of a lot about even, and you look at what we have. Look at what we opened up in 1900, the nuclear world. It's a world that we didn't know existed. Think of the fact, you know, people say the universe is entropic. But the human mind in its discoveries creates things that didn't exist before. Like controlled thermonuclear fusion, or releasing the energy of the nucleus. And we found out that there's an enormous amount available that we didn't even have the faintest idea existed. Now, is that creating something new? Was it just there? The human mind creates a different configuration in the universe. And that's ultimately the universe. As we make these discoveries, we're showing that that's the way the universe works. Now, beyond that, Einstein was political. A lot of what happened to him from the 1920s on was he was engaged in politics. He fought the Nazis. He was the main target of the Nazis from the early 1920s. They called it Jewish physics. And that's not an exaggeration. His home was ransacked. They had demonstrations against him from the early 20s. He was a friend of Walter Rathenau, who was trying to open up to Russia. Rathenau was assassinated. He helped bring people over from Germany to the United States, different mathematicians and scientists. He, of course, wrote the letter to Roosevelt calling for the development of research into the atomic bomb. He really was, this was actually something that was proposed to him by a couple of other people. And indeed, he was opposed to the dropping of the atomic bomb. He fought against Truman, but I'll give you a real sense of this. He fought for, a lot of times it's said that he was for world government, but he really wasn't. He was for nations and a collaboration amongst the great powers. He wanted, for example, the United States to open up its secrets to the Russians, to the Soviets. He wanted actually openness of that type. But there's a whole other side. Einstein fought for civil rights. I'll give you, he befriended Paul Robeson, one of the great singers and actors in the United States, but also a guy who was persecuted by the FBI. Einstein was also tracked by the FBI. There are 1,800 pages of documentation on Albert Einstein. You got to get the picture. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, hated Einstein. Einstein was not given security clearance to work on the Manhattan Project. He was considered a security risk because he was sort of a socialist of some kind or other. And let me give you an example. When W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and a well-known historical scholar, was called up under the McCarthy. It was really the Truman era. That's a whole other story. He was called up before the. Actually, he was called. He had a trial case, and he wanted. Oh, here it is. If one needs a single image to represent McCarthyism in America, it was Du Bois. He was in a federal courtroom. He was 83 years old. Du Bois had refused to go along with Washington's anti-Soviet, anti-communist policies, refusing to cooperate with congressional investigating committees. He had his passport suspended and was ousted from the NAACP. Shortly after the indictment, he was charged. Einstein sent Du Bois a copy of his book, Out of My Later Years. Du Bois wrote back and included information about his upcoming court case. Mrs. Du Bois and I have received your autographed book and with deep appreciation, and we'll read it with pleasure and profit. Then he basically asks Einstein to testify at his trial, and Einstein immediately agreed to testify. What then happened was that W.E.B. Du Bois's attorney, who was a New York City councilman, Mark Antonio, went before the judge and said, okay, I'm going to call one witness, Albert Einstein, for the defense. The judge basically immediately dismissed the case because he didn't want to have Einstein testifying for Du Bois. Okay? So he went, for example, one of the few universities he spoke at, and I have actually, maybe I'll pass a picture around, which will make the point, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, was Lincoln University outside of Philadelphia, which was a black student body, and this is the only one he wanted to do. He also then later spoke at Cheney. There's a famous incident where, why can't I find the pictures? Marian Anderson, whom some of you may know, was a great contralto, and she came to Princeton and she gave to give a performance, a concert. But there was the Princeton, which was really a southern kind of town, would not, the local inn wouldn't let her stay overnight
Because she was black.
because she was black. And Einstein said, why don't you stay with me? So she did. This is in the 1930s, I think. And then every other time she came to Princeton, she stayed with Einstein. So I think this is part of why Lynn says think like Einstein. It's because he was willing to put himself completely on the line for his ideas about physics, about the nature of science, about the future of humanity, about the human mind, and in politics. And so maybe I'll pass this picture around. And maybe the best thing now to do is to take some questions.
Well, Phil, where is he refers to Hans Christian Andersen?
Oh, I don't have the quote.
You don't have the code.
I don't think so.
Okay.
But he does refer to Hans Christian. What was it I told you?
This is skrævebladene.
Oh yeah, the
snails.
snails. Yeah, he said something to somebody about how he read Hans Christian Andersen, the story about the snails, and he compared that somehow to something he was doing.
Yeah.
So he
Not
had his.
only did he like Schiller and so forth, but also Hans Christian Andersen.
You're right.
Okay.
He was also to Copenhagen quite a few times.
Yeah, he visited Bohr up here and so forth. He left Germany when he was quite young. The only reason he went back to Germany was because of Max Planck wanted him to come back, and he stayed from 1914 to 1933 and did a lot of his top work. He had tremendous respect for Planck and for some others. He had, you know, it was a little different. He had a certain reaction to his school.
I want to switch topic a little bit. You were mentioning Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Now, he's clearly not a very likable person. But if you look carefully at what he's saying, it looks like he has read some of the text. Now, he's the first American politician that takes up the subject of debt, the enormous debt that the United States has, the middle class that is squeezed, the decline of the fundamental economy opposed to the Wall Street economy. It seems that Trump is taking up some of these subjects. That really is.
You know, I'll tell you one thing. It's probably, I doubt that Trump himself read, I don't know, I can't say. But some of the people he knows certainly know Lynn's writings. That much is true. I don't know, I don't know specific details, but there are people around him who have read Lynn and might be throwing some of these ideas in. The problem is, I think, very much the following. It's clear that Trump, he may be expressing anger and upset that's legitimate, just like Bernie Sanders did in some respects, just like the right-wing parties in Austria, or some of the unhappiness in France around Marine Le Pen. There's a certain legitimate anger, but the policies that these people represent, even if in part, you know, they're anti-bank or whatever the story might be, they have no conception of really what it is to be a human being. And look, I find you can't ignore the immigration question. If you take advantage of that and not go at the truth of the matter, you're going at the moral fabric of society. This went on in the 1930s. We know this. You know, I mean, you know, Jews and others were turned down at borders all throughout the 1930s. There's a famous story of the ship, I think it was the St. Louis. Well, I don't know the name. Anyway, the ship where the people were 900 people were turned down in Miami. They were turned down in New York. They went back to Europe, and most of them were died in concentration camps. The problem of the immigrations is the problem of the wars. The same thing, by the way, the Mexican immigration to the United States has declined over the last 10 years. And the reason it exists at all is because we imposed a low-income regime on the Mexicans. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade. So I wouldn't, see, here's the problem. We've got to do things politically. If you want to face the reality, if an American wants to face the reality, for one of the first times, the critical question is Putin and Xi Jinping, and not immediately the President of the United States. We don't have a good choice for president.
But it seems that Trump and Putin respect each other.
They might. I can't. That certainly, and I think, yeah. No, Putin said. But when Putin was asked, he said, "Look, I wasn't endorsing Trump. I was just saying, I respect what he had to say on a certain topic, and the fact that he wants to talk to us, fine. That's better than we've gotten so far." That was what Putin said.
And
Okay.
that he was a very vivid character.
Vivid character, right?
Which has some truth to it.
One scientist I saw kept making a joke, which he clearly liked, but he was talking about some of the oddities of the quantum world. And then they had a picture of Trump's hair. And he said, and here's another oddity of the physical world, the quantum world, Trump's hair. I can't, I have to say he has more hair than I have, so.
Unless it's a wig, Phil.
Yeah. But the thing is, you have to be a little bit careful of this populism, because it does touch on real anger. But look at Europe today and compare Europe to the 1930s, where you had the rise of right-wing parties, in part justifiably in the sense that you had the Depression, you had poverty, you had insane relations amongst the nations, but you ended up with hell. So just being angry, it always reminds me of this movie. I don't want to mention too many movies, but the movie, this goes back to 1976, and I never saw either of these movies. I just know what was in them. Called Network, where there's a newscaster, and their ratings are going down. The TV is getting less and less popular. So this crazy woman who's running the station tells her news broadcaster to, start spouting his opinions. And the guy gets angrier and angrier. He says, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm angry as hell, and I'm going to do something about it." Anyway, he has a slogan.
I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm not going to take it anymore. Yeah. And that's my image of Trump, if you want to know the truth. He's just expressing a kind of visceral, emotional anger that's there. But if you let that rot,
so if you wanted to read a little more about Einstein, do you have some place that's good to start, or some books you can recommend?
Well, probably the interesting thing, besides reading Einstein himself, some of his works out of my later years, his works on War and Peace, would be to read the Born-Einstein letters. Besides his own scientific works, that you'd have to see, they're very short. Most of them are, his famous 1905 papers are generally 4 or 5 pages. I think the thing on special relativity is like 5 pages or something.
Really?
Yeah, they're quite brief. I don't know if they're easy, but they're brief.
Oh.
I might have it. At least one of them is 4 or 5 pages. But he does have something called The Meaning of Relativity, which he put out in 1916, and then he updated it as late as 1951. He has a little autobiographical sketch in the Schilp volume, it's called. These are the celebration of the 70th birthday. And then he has 2 sets of essays. One is called On Science, and the other is on Physics. Those wouldn't be bad, but also the Born-Einstein letters, if you get some of the... this is not a bad edition, because it's got some good introductory material in it. It's not a bad place to start. Then there's some things that Lynn did, which you'd have to look up in the EIR or on Leibniz and Einstein, the Riemannian background of Leibniz, which covers some of the same material. All right?
Riemannian
background of Leibniz?
Yeah, it's sort of the Riemann. I get these titles wrong, but the title has Riemann and Leibniz in it, and it's the Riemannian, the Leibnizian origins of Riemann.
Okay.
Something about how you have to understand.
Is it the LaRouche Riemann method?
No, that's further back, but that's not yet.
Can you just, because we are in also the nation of Bohr,
Right.
and of course, seen from today's standpoint, Bohr is, really, he has a scientific mind compared to what else you have today.
Right.
And he, by the way, he was propagating, of course, that Denmark should have nuclear power and science, and really a driving force in using
Right.
physical science for the improvement of mankind. But there was a dispute between, as you say, between Einstein and Bohr.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that all about?
Well, Bohr was the founder of the so-called Copenhagen interpretation. It was called complementarity. Bohr's really, in a sense, though he's probably in some way had a very empiricist or positivist view. Max Born, who's the guy in these letters, is the same outlook, in some ways even more. Bohr had a funny side to him. But Bohr's view was you had to accept the empirical data that light sometimes behaved like a wave and sometimes like a particle. Electrons were sometimes like light and sometimes like particles. And that you can only have a probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. That is, really, what is the wave equation in quantum mechanics? It's a probability curve. And it just tells you the probabilities of where the particles might be. And sometimes it might act like a wave, so it would be a little bit different, and so on. And he was the one who particularly had this idea, like it's like two sides of the coin. But beyond that, in another debate that they had called on the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper of 1935, where they bring up the entanglement question and whether there's how to look at quantum activity. Bohr then becomes very clear that it's all about the observation and the measurement. That unless you include the measurement in your description of the event, you're wrong. You have to, so when they say you can measure particle B, you can assign a value to particle B based on particle A 1,000,000 miles away, Bohr says, no, that doesn't count. Because you have to actually have a measure. You have to measure something in B where it doesn't exist. And this is in part one of the aspects of quantum theory, which is that you have this probability wave. That's what exists. And somehow when you look at the object, you get the observation collapses into the most likely place. So somehow the observation itself causes the collapse of the wave into a particle or a position. Now that's all Bohr. And Bohr is basically saying, he's one that would say it's the wrong question to ask where the electron is. Well, let's just take another case. First of all, in quantum theory, the electron gives off energy randomly. You can't predict when or in what direction. And when it gives off energy, it jumps from one orbit to another. It doesn't exist in between. It exists in orbit 1 or it exists in orbit 2, but there's no 1.5. And it doesn't move from one to the other through a continuous action. Now this is all Bohr. Einstein basically goes at the philosophical or the epistemological question. His point is there is a reality. Therefore the electron, whether you observe it or not, exists. Just like Schrodinger's cat. Whether you know whether it's going to be dead or not, it's one or the other. It's not, doesn't depend on the observation. So Bohr, in some ways, though, was I think, a little better than people like Born or Heisenberg, who just dismissed Einstein as sort of a crank at a certain point. You know, it's said that Bohr, on his deathbed, I think it's in here, the last thing that he did was, this is 1960-something? The last thing he did was draw the 1935 experiment, because he still wasn't satisfied with how he had dealt with Einstein's answer. I think I have a picture. Maybe it's in this other book. Let me see.
Which experiment?
It's the 1935. It's called the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky, and it was a way of trying to. It was a thought experiment, the way Einstein does it.
There's another famous quote where Einstein says, "Der Herrgott wirft keinen Würfel," which means God doesn't throw dice.
Right. That's the one he's most. Oh, here it is. It is here. That's the most famous one. The last drawing by Niels Bohr on the blackboard in his study, 1962, was Einstein's light box of 1930. To the very end, Bohr continued to analyze the debate with Einstein about quantum mechanics and the nature of reality. So this is what he drew on the board like the day he died. So the debate was a real.
Oh.
It's not a legend. It really happened.
Can you go into some of the quantum paradoxes that you?
Well, some of them I've referenced. The not existing in between, action. But I'll give you a funny one. From the standpoint of quantum mechanics, could you have had a Big Bang? Now, of course, the whole argument is it's quantum mechanics that gives you the Big Bang. And I haven't talked about the second law of thermodynamics and so on, but human beings proved that the second law doesn't work. But remember what I said. The object doesn't exist until it's observed. Then it comes into existence as part of this collapse into reality, you might say. Hard idea to express, but that's something like what it is. Now, who was there when the Big Bang happened? Who observed the Big Bang that collapsed it from all of these probabilities into existence?
Oh, God came.
God.
And therefore you had the Big Bang.
So that's one funny example because it goes right back to the beginning. I'll give you another example. There's a guy named Alan Guth who certainly believes in quantum mechanics. And he's famous. He's one of the most famous cosmologists today. And he's renowned for something called inflation theory, just so you know. And that's basically that the reason the universe has some is more uniform than you would expect. From an explosion that might have some perturbations in it, is because there's a period of inflated development. It's going faster even than it was before. This occurs about 380,000 years after the Big Bang. Which I'm not approving I'm just telling you the way they think. And so anyway, he was talking about this, and now they've found that the universe may be expanding faster than they think again. Maybe it is. That's something that's interesting from Einstein's standpoint, or this whole thing of, anyway. So he said, well, a lot of people do wonder what's there a zillionth of a second before the Big Bang, or 1 times 10 to the 500th of a second before the Big Bang. He said, well, some people think nothing.
Stephen Hawking says that's...
What's nothing?
Yes.
What's nothing?
No God, because there was nothing before the Big Bang.
Now, Guth says maybe some people think that there were only thing that existed were universal principles. Now, that's even though he's a funny guy, that's an interesting idea. Not so much that there's a beginning, but that what's fundamental is universal principles. That's what really exists. That's what the human mind discovers. Everything else is ephemeral. That's Plato. Or Kuza, in a certain way. It goes back to that. Now, another interesting paradox, which I heard an even more extreme form of. In quantum theory, there's what they call, there's the vacuum. Now this is interesting because I don't think there is a vacuum. Leibniz didn't think there was a vacuum, and neither does Einstein. Nothing, think about it. What is nothing? If you take everything, every object and every form of energy out of the universe, it's not an easy concept. We might use the word nothing, but what does it mean? Now they believe that there are what they call quantum fluctuations constantly going on in the quantum vacuum. And this has a certain energy, which in quantum, and by the way, look, the problem, you can't make too much fun, because quantum effects are there. These things do occur experimentally. We do use quantum theory in a lot of our technology. We also use, well, I'll give you one example, later I'll tell you. I think there's a funny one for general relativity, which if anything has been even more confirmed in the last 30 or 40 years. But anyway, so this quantum flux has an energy. These are, in fact, in some cases, you can borrow from the quantum flux. You can take something, it pops out of the quantum flux, it does something, and then it goes back in a very short amount of time. Therefore, there's still conservation of energy, because it's just popped in and out of the vacuum. Okay, that's real. So this goes on, and it's kind of funny that these things do happen in particle decays and so forth. But if they're right, there should be a lot of energy in empty space between, let's say, galaxies and whatnot. Now, the total amount of energy that you would expect from this quantum flux is at least 23 orders of magnitude greater than the energy that we can measure. Now, that's a big mistake. 23 orders of magnitude. That means 23 zeros followed by a 1.
That's even more dollars than Deutsche Bank has in
Right.
derivatives.
I just heard a guy named Steven Weinberg, who's a hardcore committed quantum mechanist. He said that it's off by 56 orders of magnitude. Take your pick.
Could you also explain the gravitation waves, the idea that the discovery of the gravitation waves was a confirmation of Einstein's
Well, Einstein
theories?
had predicted it. Now, partly, he even had his doubts about it at one point, because it's such a fine measurement that he really didn't think we'd be able to ever measure it, maybe. But, of course, we have. And we have a great deal that we can do with this. But the basic idea is relatively simple. If you look at the basic general relativity field equation, basically one side of the